All right, let's dive deep, shall we? This time, we're taking a close look at the life and music of Czech composer Leoš Janáček. This guy lived from 1854 to 1928, quite a span, and from what I've gathered, his life was just as fascinating and layered as the music he wrote. We've got some excellent material here that digs into the important parts of his story, and what we want to do for you today is to really get at the heart of what made Janáček's music so unique.
I think you'll find it quite intriguing, actually, especially how his own personal experiences, the ups and downs, really wove themselves into his distinct musical voice.
Absolutely. Well, the material lays out his early years for us.
Mhm.
Seems like Janáček showed musical talent very early on. This led him to some pretty prestigious music centers for his studies, Brno, Prague, then on to Leipzig and Vienna. I also noticed that his early compositions, at least according to these sources, show the influence of composers like Antonín Dvořák, which makes sense, I guess, for a young Czech composer in those days.
Sure, it's a common pattern, isn't it? You could almost call it a stepping stone for many up-and-coming artists. They begin by drawing from those already established, seeing what works, finding their own voice that way. But with Janáček, well, the truly remarkable thing is how he shifted gears later in his career. See, right around the turn of the 20th century, he began an intense and prolonged exploration into the world of folk music. And this wasn't just a passing fancy, it completely reshaped his approach to music, his whole philosophy.
This deep dive into Moravian folk music and other Slavic traditions, it really does appear as the turning point, doesn't it? And this is where we hit this idea of speech melodies. It's the Czech term natovky mluví. Honestly, this sounds absolutely fundamental to grasping his unique style. What exactly are we talking about here for those listening who might not be familiar?
Well, imagine this. If you were to just quickly jot down the rhythm, the natural ups and downs of someone's voice as they say something with real feeling. In Czech, of course, that's essentially the core material Janáček was working with. He really got into studying and transcribing these musical contours, the stuff that's already present in everyday speech. And he was convinced that this natural music of conversation could be the base, a powerful one at that, for creating music, especially for anything involving singing or theatrical elements. So instead of forcing words into some preset melody, he'd tease out the music already there, hidden within the way people talk. This became, you could say, a hallmark of his work, setting his dramatic approach apart from, say, the usual methods like the Wagnerian style mentioned in the material. Wagner often gave his characters these big, sweeping melodies, but Janáček, he was after something different. He zeroed in on those natural inflections of spoken language. So his operas feel so immediate, grounded in real human expression.
It's really a mind shift to think of a composer finding such inspiration in the everyday speech of people, those subtle melodies and rhythms we hardly notice. But moving on, the material we have here emphasizes a deeply personal tragedy that had a huge impact on Janáček, the death of his daughter, Olga, in 1903.
This event was undeniably devastating for him, there's no doubt about it. And our sources definitely point to a direct link between this loss and the direction his music took. His opera Jenůfa, which premiered just the year later in 1904, was dedicated to her memory. And you can hear it. This opera really embodies his evolving style, very likely infused with the raw emotional outpouring from such a profound loss.
It must have been an incredibly difficult time for him. You can only imagine how that grief might have permeated the themes and the music itself in Jenůfa. As we delve further into Janáček's life, the focus shifts to his later years, where intense personal relationships played a huge role. His passionate but unfortunately unrequited feelings for Kamila Stösslová seem especially significant. She was quite a bit younger than him and, crucially, already married.
That's right. The material really stresses how strong Kamila Stösslová's influence was on him, and this lasted for the rest of his life. Their relationship was, well, let's just say it went beyond any simple definition. But their correspondence, and it was extensive, gives us invaluable insight into Janáček's aims as an artist, into what truly fueled his creativity. It suggests a very strong emotional bond between them, one that acted as a catalyst for his work, you could say.
It really is striking how these intense and sometimes unconventional personal relationships seem to tap into something fundamental in his creative output. The material also touches upon the struggles within his own marriage. Tis Dinka Šulcová, who had been his student before they married. Apparently, his growing success in Prague, coupled with his relationship with singer Gabriela Horvátová, ultimately led to what the sources describe as an informal separation from his wife. It paints a picture of a man navigating a lot of emotional turbulence in his personal life.
Absolutely, it does seem that way. It's as if Janáček's inner world was a constant interplay of powerful and often conflicting emotions. And this, as so often happens with artists, inevitably found expression in his music. The clash between his inner life and his marital situation most likely created immense tension, and for someone like Janáček, that tension could very well have been a driving force in his creative process.
But even with all this personal complexity, his path to wider recognition wasn't exactly smooth sailing. The material points out his frustration with the lack of recognition from Prague, and specifically the initial rejection of Jenůfa by the National Theatre. That must have been a tough pill to swallow.
Of course it must have been. I mean, imagine having a major work rejected by the most prominent cultural institution in your own country. That's a blow for any artist. However, things take a really positive turn with the revival of a revised version of Jenůfa in 1916 right there in Prague. And this is where everything changes for Janáček.
That revival feels like a pivotal moment, almost like a dam breaking, as you said. From what I gather, this success didn't just give him recognition in Prague. It threw open the doors to international opera stages, something he'd been longing for.
You're absolutely right. This marked a real turning point in his career. It was the broad recognition he'd been working towards, and it led to an incredibly productive and celebrated final phase in his creative life.
And what a burst of creativity it was. He produced a truly remarkable list of works during this time. Operas like Jenůfa, The Cunning Little Vixen, the orchestral Sinfonietta, the powerful Glagolitic Mass, and that's just to name a few. It's almost as if that initial hurdle being cleared unleashed this flood of artistic energy.
That does tend to happen, doesn't it? When artists struggle early on, that eventual validation can be incredibly freeing, can really energize them. And in Janáček's later works, you see a composer who's totally comfortable in his own skin, musically speaking. He's exploring a whole range of possibilities, not holding back.
Which brings us back to the heart of what makes his music so distinctive. The material points to his development of this original, modern musical style that was rooted deep in Moravian and other Slavic folk traditions. We've already touched upon the idea of speech melodies, but how did it all come together, all these elements, to create something so uniquely his?
Well, let's go a bit deeper than just speech melodies. His fascination with folk music, it went far beyond just borrowing melodies. He went all in, doing a deep analysis of the rhythmic structures, melodic traits, even stuff like the Moravian modulation, which involves that I-wraith chord progression. These analytical insights, they really shaped the very foundation of his music, the harmonic language, everything. And then there's his expanded view of tonality, meaning he wasn't afraid to throw together harmonic areas that you wouldn't usually expect to hear side by side. The effect is this raw emotional honesty, bypassing the typical musical expectations. This is a key aspect of his modern approach, I'd say. And then you've got those unorthodox chord spacings and structures he used, all adding to the freshness, that distinct character of his musical world.
And let's not forget the sesavky. These are those short, recurring motifs that pop up in his music. I love John Tyrrell's description of them. He calls them a little flash of time, almost a kind of musical capsule. Tiny, swift motifs with remarkably characteristic rhythms that are supposed to pepper the musical flow.
Really paints a picture, doesn't it? How do these sesavky contribute to the overall feel of his music?
They're vital, really. They're like these bursts of energy, these little musical cells, both rhythmic and melodic, that keep coming back, but with variations each time. And this creates this feeling of momentum, a distinct rhythmic drive. You could almost say they act like rhythmic fingerprints, these short musical ideas that weave themselves throughout a piece, giving it this unique pulse, almost like a heartbeat woven into the music. In a way, there are parallels to minimalist composers who came later, although Janáček's harmonic language remains very much his own. It's clear that his Moravian roots were a huge source of inspiration for him, a well that never ran dry. The material we have here also points out his deep and lifelong affection for Russia and its culture. This feels like another important thread in his artistic tapestry.
It most definitely is. Think about his admiration for Tchaikovsky, his involvement with the Russian Circle in Brno, and even his engagement with Russian literature, which is reflected in works like Taras Bulba, Ka Kabanova, and From the House of the Dead. It all adds up to a significant connection. It seems he really identified with the emotional depth and dramatic intensity that often characterized Russian art.
So even though he was firmly rooted in Czech and Slavic traditions, he remained open to and even inspired by other cultural influences. The material briefly mentions his interest in composers like Charpentier and Puccini. He seemed to possess this broad artistic curiosity, even as his core identity as a composer remained closely tied to his roots.
Exactly. It's not like he existed in a vacuum. He was aware of and engaged with what other composers across Europe were doing at the time. But he had a way of filtering these influences through his own lens, always returning to and building upon that fundamental connection he had to Czech and Slavic musical idioms.
It's fascinating to consider the impact his work had and continues to have. The material really emphasizes the role played by the Australian conductor Charles Mackerras. After Janáček's death, Mackerras championed his music, going so far as to restore some of his compositions to their original versions. That kind of dedication, advocating for an artist's work, can be so crucial in ensuring their legacy lives on and reaches new listeners.
Couldn't agree more. Mackerras, his tireless efforts were so important in bringing Janáček's music to a wider audience. It's challenging music, sometimes complex, but Mackerras helped solidify its place in the standard repertoire. And the fact that Janáček's unique voice inspired a new generation of Czech composers speaks volumes, doesn't it? It really showcases the originality and lasting influence of his artistic vision.
And it feels right, completely fitting that he's now regarded as one of the most important Czech composers, right up there with Dvořák and Bedřich Smetana. The growing international recognition he received in his final years, things like being elected to the Prussian Academy of Arts, really suggest that the world was finally catching up to his unique genius.
It truly does. He endured periods of neglect, of being misunderstood, but he ultimately achieved lasting recognition. His story is a powerful example of the enduring power of a truly unique artistic vision, a vision that refused to be silenced.
As we look back at Janáček's life, what strikes me is how tightly woven his personal experiences were with his groundbreaking work in music. The deep sorrow of losing his daughter, the intensity of his relationships, all these things became intertwined with his artistic innovations and his ultimate triumph over adversity. It's a captivating story of a life fully lived and poured directly into his art.
Couldn't have put it better myself. He took those raw, often turbulent experiences from his own life and transformed them into music that, even today, continues to resonate with audiences. There's a directness there, an honesty, a profound sense of what it means to be human.
It really makes you think.
Yeah.
When you consider his laser focus on the nuances of human speech, that almost microscopic attention to those napevky movie, could that dedication, that unique approach, have been the key to his ability to convey such deep and often complex emotions through music? It's a question worth pondering as you continue to explore and appreciate the remarkable, deeply personal contributions Janáček made to the world of music.